Coming up, we go live as the New York Football Giants put in their waiver claims looking to improve the depth across this roster. Who did they hit on? Who did they miss? And how will it impact not only the current roster, the practice squad, and how this team moves towards opening weekend just 11 days away? We dive in coming up next. Yes, my friends, it is OGP, the One Giant podcast, where you know that I am one of your hosts, Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the waiver wire claims as they should be coming through here momentarily. 12 p.m. cutoff today to submit those claims. Giants in the 6th position overall, noted by a couple of different media members coming in that it's not a fantasy football draft style where you pick at 6 and then it goes through everybody, then you pick again. You can submit multiple claims all in one package. So we'll see where that goes for the New York Football Giants. A couple of house cleaning things that we can take care of right now as it stands already. There's a few things here. So per Tom Pelissero, the Giants placed wide receiver Isaiah McKenzie on season-ending IR injured reserve. That's unfortunate for McKenzie, mostly because Gunnar was already out there and then he had taken on that role. So the Giants continue to look for answers in their return game. How much priority could they place inside of these waiver claims for a player that has dual ability as a returner and maybe also positional value elsewhere on the roster? Also had per Pat Leonard talking about KJ Cloyd has been announced that he'll be signing with the practice squad. Had a nice final preseason game, really showed out for the team. So liked what he did. Young player, certainly has some talent. So he should make it through there. One other thing, which comes through from Dan Duggan, and he'll probably be mentioning his name a number of times here along the way. When we talk about where this team is going to go, how many claims are going to get put in, and then what about the cuts that they made in getting to 53? So Dan Duggan said he'd be renting if I was any of the final 10 or so guys on the initial 53. So that's part one of it. But then the other side of this, I think, too, is when we talk about where this roster stands, it doesn't look like indications are that any of the Giants players, at least at this moment, that were cut are going to be claimed by other teams. So we again find ourselves, and we talked a little bit about this yesterday when we had our live cutting down to the 53. What does that mean for the depth of this team? If you're not only talking about, okay, we have to go from 90 to 53, and every team's going to have 25 guys that are there primarily for the camp, primarily for reps to be on practice squads, right? 16 positions there as well. And then you have the guys you get towards 53. I mean, the last 10 to 15 players should be difficult decisions that you need to make. When you combine that with hearing Dan Duggan say, boy, I don't know, even those last 10 roster spots are still going to be fluid. So we're talking about when you went into camp with 90 players on this roster and injuries and otherwise that come along the way, obviously. But when you talk about a 90-man group that maybe we're talking closer to 45 than to 53 represent real cemented true value as obviously the starters, but then also the depth behind it, it still speaks to a concern area for the Joe Schoen era of the New York Football Giants, where depth remains an issue here. And it's something that if we have time before the regular season, I think we'll tap back into and look at where did we start when Joe Schoen took over and where are we today entering year number 3. Now, the proof will be on Sundays this season and how this team performs overall, but there's at least something there that's worth exploring and discussing. One other guy is going to be Adams, linebacker. He got designated for return, so that means 4 weeks off at the start of the season. Then he'll have a 21-day window to get back up to speed. So the Giants like what he did. Obviously, the injuries hurt, so you had to go ahead and wait and see on him when he'll get back into the fold. Up until that point, we're now in the holding pattern of waiting to see when the official 53 will get announced. 53, when any claims will get announced and what that'll look like. What we have heard, too, is as far as positional value, center is something that you can expect because John Michael Schmitz has had injuries. I wouldn't say that we've been enamored with any of the players that have been there on the depth right now. So you could look at centers maybe being a claim target. You could also look at the linebacker room, obviously, because you still have Carter Coughlin there. You have the rookie in Muasau, but there's some availability there. And the largest looming one is obviously going to be in that secondary at the cornerback position. Who's playing across from Deonte Banks? In theory, if we had seen Cordell Flott all summer long, maybe he would have shown us something. There was, the positional shift for him playing from the inside, going to the outside. Was there a confidence from Shane Bowen making that decision, or was it just testing and trying it out? We saw one preseason game where Trey Hawkins flashed and looked like the player we saw last preseason. And then we saw another game where the reps were pretty difficult for him. So I don't think that there is any guarantee here as far as the way you look at that secondary room and saying, oh, this player has X role. And even Dan Duggan also elaborated on a question over on X about Isaiah Simmons and what his role is going to look like. I don't think we're talking about a player that is going to be lining up in the slot and covering that position on Sundays this season. But he's being labeled as this hybrid in-between player. So there's some ambiguity about what is his role and how often will he be utilized. He's versatile, but when will you be able to put him in there and not risk, especially if you talk about pre-snap motion and maybe getting put into a spot where now he does have to go into those coverage areas against a lot of quick twitchy. We saw John Mechie, the third, do this from the Houston Texans, right? You don't want him in that matchup. Are you going to be able to have the personnel on the field to be able to make those adjustments in real time and avoid some of those issues? Live on YouTube, by the way, as we see some people filing in here, happy to have everybody along the way. We can highlight things like this, such as that from New Yorker. Let's get 2 cornerbacks, a defensive tackle, and a middle linebacker, and 1 safety, and we're set. I mean, listen, yeah, you can just go ahead and grab all those things, right? Who are the players that we like that have been available that were cut candidates? Who do the Giants end up claiming? Sure. But the reality is you're not just claiming an instant starter here. I mean, you can claim a player that's better or an improvement on a position for the New York Giants. It doesn't mean that they're going to walk in the door and you're going to automatically say, oh, well, thank goodness. It looks like we're going to be all set here. Now, I highlighted a few guys that we can walk through here for the New York Giants. Just these are players that have been cut from a couple other teams, and I just noted them in the room potentially for the Giants to look at. For the Vikings first here, defensive lineman Jonah Williams is certainly a player, has some veteran experience. If we're talking about adding a little bit of depth there, we still think that when you look inside that defensive front, guys like DJ Davidson, Jordan Riley, I don't think is a bad player, but I think if you get better depth, you would. Also, then you go and you head back into that secondary where I said, listen, yes, Lewis Cine is clearly a player that has now been labeled a bust, drafted by the Vikings, first round pick, but 6'2", sub 440 time. The question is about whether or not he has the hip flexibility and the twitchiness to be able to play at the cornerback spot. If you're talking about looking in that safety room and saying, well, do we think that any of the players, Javarius Owens actually, I think, did make the final 53. There was some confusion about it and may have been the designated to return for Adams that allowed Owens to stay there, but he's still a late round pick. So are we talking about, definitely wanting to keep him? We've highlighted Alex Johnson, waiting to see if he gets through the practice squad. But if you want to have a 4th safety on game day and you don't believe that the versatility of Isaiah Simmons is going to be that guy, I would take a flyer on a guy like Lewis Cine because the pedigree is there. And again, while you may not be able to put him in certain coverage situations, if you're looking for safety value first and then maybe coverage value and traditional cornerback work second, he at least has the skill set or the measurables to be put into that room. Whether or not it pans out, listen, there's bust every single draft class. And for the Vikings, he's been labeled as 1. Let's also take a look. I'm going to go ahead and assume that Bronx Boy is looking for Andy. That's the only that's where we're all waiting for, right? He unfortunately had some obligations today, but we'll be in tomorrow talking about fallout and then breaking down all the claims. We'll obviously cover them here as they come through. What does it mean for practice squad? And then we can start to really get a sense of where this roster stands heading towards the regular season, which after this week, we turn our attention over to week 1, Minnesota Vikings, and how we're going to improve. Listen, something like Ryan Williams saying, like, we need, some good talent and depth or on depth. Of course, Like that's really the discussion point here. And if you're joining in along the way live on YouTube as we cover the waiver claims for the New York Football Giants, waiting for some of that information to come through here, you have to take a step back here and remember, as I was highlighting, not only all the cuts that happened, the premise that it seems like not a lot of the cuts for the Giants are going to get claimed by other teams. So that means guys that we talked about being on the bubble of this roster, players 50 to 65, let's say, or you got to get down to 53, and you're talking about practice squad too. If nobody else has an urgency to go get those players, then where are we in our depth, right? And if you go and claim those guys, then what you have to think about is they're going to the 53. So who are the players that we'd be bumping down off of the roster when we look inside that 53-man unit right now? So we'll take a look at that as well coming up here in a little bit. We'll reset the table, remind you of the 3 moves that have come up already. I think there's one other practice squad projected signing that has come through here along the way. So we'll cover those. Continue to wait now, as Dan Duggan told us, by the way, should be coming in right after the noon hour. So we want to be in here, see what those live reactions look like. And I'll also highlight a handful of other players out of Cleveland that I thought were notable cuts that the Giants might be interested as well. Continuing on the other side of the break momentarily. All right, as we cover the New York Football Giants waiver claim and the NFL as a whole, we remind you that today's episode is going to be brought to you by Personam. Personam is an excellent, Personam.ai, by the way, an excellent tool for businesses when we talk about looking inside and having the right cyber threat detection. This is the engine to do it for you. It's improving your vision into your network security environment and allows you to see cyber threats that other tools and platforms simply cannot do. Personam is always vigilant and always learning. You can check out Personam, that's PERSONAM.ai today. All right, pleasantries dispensed. Back at the top, KJ Cloyd making it through to the practice squad. That's been reported by Pat Leonard. McKenzie goes to season-ending IR, remains an opening here at the returner position, which I think now with the new rules on kickoff does kind of shift it back the other way. Now, we already saw a season ago before they brought in Gunner that, hey, this isn't a guy that can catch the ball. Fair catch is enough. We would take that at this point. But you also maybe want to look at those dynamics, especially on kickoffs now, with the way that lineup is going to be. There's an opportunity here. And we did see, I think, Turbo Miller go back on some returns in that final preseason game. He's a guy that we expect to make it through to the practice squad as well. But what is the expectations for him long term? So going to be interesting to see how that unfolds too. And then Adams put through on the designated to return. A couple other notes here for you guys in the chat. We've got Cy Guy Bry, frequent flyer. We need a needle in a haystack. Yeah, well, there you go. So let's get into that. Speaking of potential guys to be brought in here off the cut wire, and hopefully some of these things, obviously, as they rotate through, we'll hear reports that other teams have claimed players, and so some of them will fall away here. I mentioned before looking at the Vikings and what they had done in terms of their cuts and how the Giants maybe could target some of them. I also thought looking at linebacker Tony Fields II out of Cleveland would be an option for the New York Football Giants. Also, Tyler Huntley. They're talking about how they want to move on from Jameis Winston or Huntley. Again, quarterback is very second, third, fifth, ninth thing down the rung here for me. But if I one-to-one, there's certain quarterbacks that I like, and I'm actually going to reflect back on some names that I mentioned yesterday before I kind of shut down for the day that I think would be notable players for the Giants to look at too. I always liked Tyler Huntley. Remember, he came in and when Lamar Jackson went down. Maybe it is, grass is always greener, but I think I would prefer a player like him over a player like Tommy DeVito if we're talking about carrying a third quarterback on this roster. That's just me. I do, however, like some of those other names that we mentioned there out of Cleveland. Linebacker potentially. There's one other one here. Let me just back up and make sure that I mention him too. Just that Fields had 10 starts in his 3-year career. Special teams value as well. And it just turned 25. So if you want to have kind of a guy with some experience and some additional value, depending on who you have to cut in order to make room for him, he'd be a value that I would obviously look at. Yesterday, I mentioned a couple of names like cornerback Kevin King. So he hasn't been healthy since 2021 when he was playing with the Green Bay Packers. But at that time, he played to a 70.6 PFF grade. Now, he got injured in that year. I find him to be a fascinating one, mostly because when we talk about these cut candidates, there aren't necessarily a lot of guys that you're going to be able to look at and say, hey, I can at least think about what they've accomplished in their career to this point. You go back and you look at him, and we'll go ahead and get his starts covered up here. Going back, obviously, to his time, as I mentioned, with the Green Bay Packers, didn't make it out of camp this upcoming season, forgetting where he was signed with as a cut candidate. Now, he's going to be 26 going on what? So 28, 29 years old now, has not been healthy in a couple of seasons, and that's a problem. But he did start 2019, 14 games, 2020, 11 games. Obviously, the concern would be health here. If we go inside of some of his advanced stats, doesn't mean that it's absolutely perfect, but he held opposing QBs to 58.8% in 2019, 63% in 2020. Now, 2021, which I marked as being a good year and what he was able to work with as far as a PFF grade, did surrender 20 completions on 28 targets. As far as ratings go, that was the first year that we saw opposing QB spike 108.9. Prior to that was under 100 every one of those seasons as well. So there's some things to like there. Notably, the thing not to like about him would be the missed tackle percentage, over 17% for the first 3 seasons of his career before the injury shortened one where it was 3.3. But again, that's only on 6 games and 1 game started that season. But he was playing 82%, 92% of the starting reps in 2019 and 2020, only 48% before the injury in 2021. So whether or not that's the perfect player, it's at least a name that I would have my eyes open for to see whether or not he can be a player that has an impact. And that's all relative to other names that are going to come out here too. Other guys that I had mentioned, just to round it out, defensive end Carl Lawson, 27 career sacks. Certainly something, if we're talking about, again, looking at the defensive front or looking at guys like Azeez Ojulari and whether or not the Giants tried to make a move with him, which would only indicate that they maybe don't have confidence in what he'll bring to the depth of that room and just strengthen the front across the board. He has versatility on the defensive line there. Certainly a player I would look at. And then CJ Henderson has been another player that people have thrown out. 39 career starts and still only going to be 26 years old. So I would take a look at him. I know people have thrown out Caleb Farley with the Tennessee Titans because of the ties to Shane Bowen. I stopped short of that just to, because it ultimately is a player that does not have a great sample size and has injuries. So it's a small sample, if anything, to be able to look at. Have this one from Blessed Believer. I'm not greedy. I just want a QB, a center, a kick returner, a punt returner, 3 cornerbacks, and offensive tackle. Yeah. What's the problem? Offensive line is another area to watch for here. Obviously, do they have any belief in what they're looking at when it comes to either Azudu, obviously coming back from the injury and getting limited reps, live reps in preseason for Evan Neal. So do they go out into the market to try to find a veteran player there? We know Kubis made it through on the initial 53. Would he be one of the first guys to go? Stinney is there. Schlottman is there. So there's a few different names that could get shifted out if they bring in a veteran player that they want to make sure that they're anchored behind Andrew Thomas on the left and then behind Illuminor, I almost said Azudu again, on the right side of the line. Coming in here from Ryan again, definitely Tyler Huntley, better than DeVito, and knowing the Giants, they would not even look that way. Listen, one thing that I'll use this as it, because I personally do like Tyler Huntley, and I liked him in the offseason when the Giants were going to be exploring how are we approaching what this quarterback room is going to look like in the upcoming season. I said Huntley is a guy that they should have taken a look at the time. But the reality of, and we said this about some of our players, you're excited, we're debating the cuts, the 53-man roster. Well, and I think we used Azeez Ojulari as the example, saying, well, we're sitting here talking about we need to go get a guy because you can't trust Azeez Ojulari with the injuries. The production has dropped a little bit. But then is there, another team that's out there saying, oh, we would trade for Azeez Ojulari because we have a guy who hasn't really panned out, didn't quite look like it. So I think sometimes, obviously, you look across and see perceived value on another roster when, hey, the guys that you have sometimes aren't as flashy or sometimes don't have the hype that they had coming in over the first couple of seasons, but still have value to the roster. I do agree, though, the New York Giants are sometimes loyal to a fault, right? They'll go the extra step with a player wanting to see that growth and development. And that's goes hand in hand with the fact that if they've been in the building and you have seen developmental steps going forward, then you want to stick with them. So I think we have to look at it as, well, certainly we expect claims to come through and for this roster to look a little bit different. The one thing that we aren't talking about as we wait for claims to come through is that the New York Giants at a starting level, so we talk about defense, the defensive front is obviously going to be a massive strength for them, right? Dexter Lawrence, Kayvon Thibodeau, Bobby Okereke taking a step back into the linebacker room, Brian Burns, those four right there alone. This could be one of the most dangerous defensive fronts in the NFL this season. Is that going to be strong enough against every opponent to be able to maybe cover up some of the deficiencies in the secondary? We'll see. But obviously, you have to have incredible confidence in that unit. On the back end of this team, while I think that there is still some things to see when it comes to game day for Dane Belton, and then obviously you have rookie Tyler Nubin. Pinnock was a find off the practice squad for the Jets. We've loved what he's been for this team. It's not a perfect safety room either, and you hear the Giants may want to add someone else there, but I like that room. So as we talk about refining the back end and depth of the roster, these things are important, but there are starting level players that you have to be excited about. Offensively, I love the wide receiver core. Now that you have Malik Neighbors in that room, everyone falls into place, right? Wan'Dale Robinson, I think Jalen Hyatt's ready to take that step. We know they kept Darius Slayton around. We were an advocate for that. And right now, he's a little bit higher on the pecking order by all accounts than Jalen Hyatt. But you can see that transition at any point. That top four is exciting. That some guys, as you go up the scale, you say, well, Jalen Hyatt needs to really prove it because he has the smallest sample size last year. I think Wan'Dale Robinson has already shown it, and now it's about how much more versatile can he be because you have Malik Neighbors at the top. And Darius Slayton, for whatever he is or is not, we know that he is a consistent player year over year, giving you 700 plus, right? Giving you the 50 catches and being certainly a veteran in that wide receiver room. So I love what they're doing in the wide receiver room right now. I wouldn't mind they kept Bryce Ford-Wheaton. That could be a surprise guy, but you're not banking on any of that. The question marks, I think, offensively, if we just cap off the other areas that I'm excited about, it's obviously Andrew Thomas. I wish I saw Runyon just get some reps, dealing with the shoulder, and he should be back and fine for the regular season, but you just want to see that. John Michael Schmitz, again, it's the injuries that are concerning because you're not getting the reps. And then you get into having Illuminor there and then Van Roten. Excited isn't quite the word, but satisfied is certainly the way that I would describe what they did on the offensive line coming into this season. I'm satisfied that they made sure to improve key positions. Whether or not the depth is a concern, hey, for an offensive line that year over year has basically been a rotating cast on the starting units, at least we feel like we can set up our starting five here and say, yeah, that's the unit we go in with. And then if there's injuries, we have to see who's capable of stepping up. So they've at least massively improved on paper in that category. Running back room as well. I mean, all these areas, right? I think that Singletary will not be flashy, but I think he'll always get the job done for you. And then we have some of these other players that we like. Eric Gray had a strong offseason, strong camp. That's a good sign. Tyrone Tracy Jr., right? So it is a good reminder to go at the highest level and say, how do we feel about the starters on our roster? The depth does matter. And as of right now, I'm curious to see how the Giants are approaching it. Nothing in just yet. And we'll see here, checking in on something from Art Stapleton. That's a humorous joke from Art Stapleton as they wait for it as well. That he has also not been claimed off of waivers or anything of the nature. So he'll be staying covering Big Blue. So we wait to see. It's interesting also as well. 3 cornerbacks to the Panthers. Oh, this is interesting here. This came from Ryan Dunleavy, but originally from Ari Mervov, who says have the number 1 spot in the waivers, and they're taking it seriously. Every player that they placed a claim on is coming to them. And that is cornerback Shamar Bartholomew, who was from the Jets, Keenan Isaac from the Bucks, Tariq Castro Fields from the Commanders. So their top 3 claims came through, and those are all cornerbacks. So if you're the Giants and you want them to add them, there's obviously guys ahead of you on this waiver claim order that have grabbed a handful of guys. They also grabbed Jamie Sharif from Seattle, and then another one from Seattle, linebacker but special teamer John Radigan. So while we don't know yet where the Giants are going, we do at least know where some other teams are going ahead of them. 3 cornerbacks that are all getting claimed by the Carolina Panthers. That can start to put a little bit of a kink in the agenda here for the New York Football Giants. While we wait for it, feel free to shout out any players that you are maybe more confident on currently on the 53-man roster than perception would say. So, and it's identifying backup players, right? Do you feel confident in Jordan Riley or a DJ Davidson, where I kind of question that a little bit? If we look over at this roster right now and talk about where it currently stands from a depth standpoint, go inside the linebacker room. You know, one of the players that I think is that I'm quietly okay with, and I wonder if fans still have confidence, that's Carter Coughlin. I mean, listen, he's primarily a special teams contributor, but Micah McFadden, who we didn't get to see a lot of with his injuries this offseason, Deontay Johnson, they chose to hold on to him as well. And then Muasau. Like, yes, you'd like to get one more body in there. But I think even with Muasau being a player that we like, but also a guy that if he ends up on the practice squad, we can completely understand it. If you told me I go in with a Karake McFadden, Deontay Johnson, small sample, but you do like it, and then Carter Coughlin plus one more body, and a body that maybe gives you a little more coverage value. I think I could wrap my head around that and be comfortable with it. Likewise, in the room with Azeez Ojulari, talk about Kayvon Thibodeau. There's Benton Whitley, and then obviously you have Brian Burns as well. Where do we get an extra little bit of depth there too? So there's one more other piece that you want to see brought into that room just so that you can safeguard against injuries. But I mean, there's a lot of things to like. I don't know, there's a lot of young talent to like. Yesterday when we were doing our live, we had people saying, got to find a replacement that the for Drew Phillips. They put it inside the group of the safeties, as I get an update here on the back end. How you can judge young players, Tyler Nubin, Drew Phillips, any of these guys, we got to see it on game day. And that's a big part of what's going to happen here. Going to step away for just one moment, and then I'll come back in and provide the update for another player making the choice to stay with the New York Football Giants and joining their practice squad. We'll be back in just one moment, breaking down and waiting for the waiver claims to come through here for the New York Football Giants. Thank you for bearing with me right there as I get my mic back on live here on YouTube, and can confirm per sources that Alex Johnson, fan favorite of the show, is going to be signing with the New York Football Giants on their practice squad. That is a good sign for me. I think if we look at these waiver claims, and again, you talk about the safety room, he's a player. If we're discussing the guys that we like and think are good developmental, he's in a really good spot, I think, to continue to grow his game, work within the Shane Bowen system. And again, I said this, I would not be surprised if we're talking about Alex Johnson getting a call up on Sundays this season. Just feel good about that from a safety room standpoint, from a versatility standpoint. We talk about Isaiah Simmons and what his role is going to be. We know that they cut ties with Darnay Holmes. We'll see where that shakes out. There is openings here across this secondary, and I think that Alex Johnson's the kind of player that you want to have in that room if you can. Still waiting, though. As of course, the Giants, by the way, yesterday as well, they were very late in confirming and releasing their 53-man roster, which I thought was interesting. I wonder if it will have that kind of delay here when it comes to where their claims end up. But typically, even if the Giants aren't going to release it officially, you get those drips and drabs from elsewhere around the league. So we continue to wait for the Giants and to see who they'll end up claiming here and whether or not they address a number of key areas. And by the way, when it comes to Alex Johnson, I can let you know too, per sources, that he had multiple other offers to join other practice squad teams. So there was interest in him as a player. Again, if you didn't go and watch the interview with his agent, George Holley, feel free to go check that out. It's on our feed. Discusses the fact that by the time he finally steps into a prominent role at UCLA, it gives a great sample size, but he then was not eligible for the combine. And that was the kind of guy that scouts wanted to see there and see those measurables. So now all of a sudden, you have a player who maybe flew a little bit under the radar, but the Giants were the first ones to want to come to the table for him and give him the opportunity in camp. And there seems to be a sense of loyalty there, which we mentioned earlier. While sometimes the Giants can be too loyal, hey, when it comes to a young, undrafted free agent rookie, you really like the fact that they chose to be loyal, and he chose to be loyal to the Giants as well. I think there's a big opportunity for him over the next season and beyond. There's a way here that Alex Johnson can develop and become, I think, a nice contributor for this team over the long term, not to overstate it. I just need to update one thing over here and check in on X as well as we continue to wait with bated breath for the official claims that went in for the New York Football Giants. One other element here too, after I just get this posted up, that the Giants, we thought maybe we're going to be working the trade calls as well. There were multiple trades that went on from different teams around the league. And for the Giants maybe to have been interested in and unable to achieve getting across the line on some trades to maybe shuffle the deck of their depth rather than cutting players or rather than keeping certain players on the 53. Maybe we find out about that in the coming days. But again, if we're talking about where the value or where the talent level of the roster currently stands from a depth standpoint, how many teams would have been high level interested in looking at players? And by the way, teams around the league had to do this too, cutting wide receivers that they wanted to. Denver with Patrick, we'd love to trade him. Okay, we'll also just wait. He'll go in, and then if he doesn't get claimed, can sign him outright, whatever the case may be. And as we know, there is also always a factor for any team about the contracts and what salary you're taking on if you go ahead and claim them versus letting them work their way all the way through to the waiver wire. Going ahead and just updating one note here for myself. I appreciate everybody that's in on the live. We'll get back into your questions and comments in just 1 second. As we are eagerly waiting this waiver claim. Because anything short of getting a couple of key players into the room, however they work out, is going to, I think, be a point of frustration for the fan base, undoubtedly. All right. Got that all set up. I apologize for taking a minute there on the side. If you have any questions over on YouTube, obviously running live, we'll rewind it back to the top here briefly for you, just to remind you that KJ Cloyd went through he's going to be signing with the practice squad. Just talked about Alex Johnson. He'll be in on the practice squad as well. Interesting to hear about some other guys. Isaiah Hodgins was an interesting cut candidate along with veteran Allen Robinson. Allen Robinson ending up in the practice squad, don't know. As a veteran, maybe he still thinks that he can catch on somewhere else. Or we can take a look at Isaiah Hodgins and say some people have liked what he's done. 7 touchdowns over the last couple of seasons, big performance in the Vikings playoff game. Are there other teams that are interested? Or is Isaiah Hodgins looking at other teams and saying, where do I have a better opportunity? Because if there's a very clear pecking order, at least right now for the Giants from a top 4 perspective, how often am I going to get on the field, or how often am I going to get those looks? Something to think about for not just Hodgins, but anybody. Let's get into this one here. What's the running back order in terms of the depth chart? It's going to be Singletary, Gray, and then Tyrone Tracy Jr. That's who they have right now. That's who they'll roll with. Jakob Johnson also, he's going to go through as the vested veteran with 4 years of experience, so they need to go through that process. He's coming back. I think I failed to mention him earlier. That's not a running back, but it is a part of the blocking scheme potentially that the Giants want to use. So we'll see how that shakes out with the top roster. But yeah, Singletary is going to be, I think, primarily your bell cow. I am curious to see about how much he carries it versus reps that are going to go to Gray or go to Tyrone Tracy Jr., at least as we get into the season. Remember, Tyrone Tracy Jr. obviously had that scare early in the season, in camp here, bounced back from what we thought was going to be an absolutely devastating injury and should be mostly fine now. But when you look at Devin Singletary, he had 898 yards, almost 900 yards last season in his 1 year with Houston, and this was a career-high 216 carries. So there is a lot of reps there that he can and has shown he can take onto his shoulders. 177 the year prior, 188, 156, 151. So, do you take this as he's 26 years old and say going into your age 27 season, are we going to ramp you up for 250, 250 plus carries? I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. I also think that it is going to be important to take a look at how Eric Gray looks on game day early in the season, right? Because a year ago, bad offensive line, we know that plagues everybody, but there have been times when we've looked at those games and said, oh, does Eric Gray quite have it? Nice flash in the preseason game against Houston. Could have been against Detroit. But then the offensive line play struggles in game number 3, and you don't see any of him. You're seeing a lot of Dante Miller. So you still do want to see that proof. But I like the idea of Singletary leading that group. Obviously, Tyrone Tracy Jr. is this converted wide receiver, versatile weapon. But how do you play with that? And if Eric Gray, who caught some passes in preseason as well, can be that north and south, hey, get there, has enough burst, but then also offers confidence for Daniel Jones to look for him out of the backfield. I think what you want is that repeatable group of players that you can always go to and say, you don't know defensively what you need to watch for here. And while not having an elite talent like Saquon Barkley, you lose a great talent, your team lessens at that position. But the hope here is that collectively all these guys offer enough of that versatility. And even though it was not a part of Devin Singletary's bread and butter, he did have this past season 30 catches on 38 targets. He had 38 catches on 52 targets. Like, he had 50 targets in his last 3 seasons in Buffalo, and all the way back to his rookie year, 41. So he has seen basically 40 or above. He's averaged about 45 targets per season. He's gone ahead and had a catch percentage damn solid. Now, these aren't always the most dynamic of plays, right? You're talking about swing passes out of the backfield, but he has had a very strong showing inside of the receiving game as well. So this is where I think you're trying to balance it a little bit, right? Because he ends up, as we said, 216 carries, 246 total touches. You can go back 2 seasons to Buffalo. He had 228. So that volume has been there, sometimes flexed into a different area. So certainly it's going to be something where he needs to be doing everything. To the Giants, you also threw in there grab Ritter. I put him up there when I was mentioning guys like King yesterday and some other names that I would keep an eye on, certainly. I personally, again, I mentioned Tyler Huntley. He is a player that already has a track record and is showing you some things that you would say, hey, that'd be an upgrade over Tommy DeVito. I also think that if it was me personally, and I did like Desmond Ritter coming out of college, obviously it didn't look great with the Atlanta Falcons, and then they have such a talent pool and they're ready to kind of win now, and they make the pivot, and I think it's a smart pivot for them. But Desmond Ritter is 25 years old. Again, I would immediately like the idea of letting Brian Daboll work with him, right? If there's any confidence level that you have in what Tommy DeVito has been able to do, you have to like the development of that from the coaching staff. And we think that Brian Daboll plays a large role in that. So why not take a look at a guy that's certainly at a higher draft pedigree and is just someone that if you walked him in the door as your third QB, if I'm carrying him on game day, I would take a shot on that. I would 100% take a look at that. Side Guy Bra, you came in with, do we really want to sign Winston? No, I hope not, as you say. I hope that we don't. Now, again, well, I'll cover this from two angles. One reason that you don't want the Giants to sign Jameis Winston is because you signed Drew Lock to be the starter, the backup to Daniel Jones, because you believe in him, right? So if you're going to bring in Jameis Winston, who's certainly removed from, the heyday of who he was as a quarterback, you're bringing in another guy that has a lot of experience, obviously, has a monster arm, by the way. I mean, this is going to feel like I'm saying it as that I'm saying it like as a negative about him. He is now what? 30, going to be 31 years old. He has a ton of obviously reps under his belt. He played every game his first 2 seasons, missed 3 his third year, and moved out of being a starter after 2019. Backed up with limited action in 2020. And then these last 2 years, though, you've seen him come in, combined 6-4 record over those 2 years. He played in 7 games in 2023 as well. I mean, listen, he threw 161 pass attempts in 2021, which would be the high watermark in terms of throws that he had. 59% completion, 1,100 yards, 14 up, only 3 down, right? But, it's the cannon for the arm that you like from him. And just that's really what you'd be selling yourself on. I personally wouldn't go in that direction if it was me, because, again, you're talking about him being the third quarterback on the depth chart here. One of the things that we debated is or that I think you can examine when you see things come through is the New York Giants have to have a sense of where they want their season to go or where they feel like their season needs to go. And if you sit there, as we may have some waiver claims coming through here, we'll take a look. Care of Tom Pelissero. So we'll go ahead and see if the Giants come up here on it. Okay, they do. Okay, so we have one that we're going to talk about here coming up in a second. Only one claim so far indicated by Tom Pelissero. But with any of these decisions, how much are you safeguarding against? Well, if Daniel Jones gets hurt, then what do we have confidence in Drew Lock? And then if we feel like, boy, we can't risk losing Drew Lock to an injury and then not being able to still play at a fairly high level, that might dictate about who you want to have there. Maybe they have the confidence in Tommy DeVito, but I personally would look for someone else. Mentioned Huntley, mentioned Ritter here as well. I wouldn't be interested in Jameis Winston, but that's to be seen. Okay, let's look up and talk about the first waiver claim that we can confirm here. Anthony Johnson from Green Bay, DB out of Iowa State. He is a New York Football Giant. Get a look inside of his numbers. Total transparency, don't know who I'm going to be pulling up here for the former Green Bay Packer and now new New York Football Giant. So we'll go ahead and get a look at where he's coming out of and hopefully get a sense of if the Giants have brought in some competition, some nice depth, or what it's going to mean for them. All right. Anthony Johnson, as I get his stats up here, going to be a pain in the butt to surface these up here. All right, here we go. So Anthony Johnson for the Green Bay Packers last season. Let's see if we can get the stats up on him. And we'll take a look. I'm also just keeping an eye, apologize, on what the Giants have in terms of additional waiver claims potentially here. Let's step away for 1 minute. I just want to check in on Tom Pelissero's feed, see if we have any other new updates here, and then we'll get into a couple questions in the chat and also dive a layer deeper here on the first official waiver claim, Anthony Johnson, former DB from Green Bay, now going to be a member of Big Blue. We'll come right back in and continue our waiver wire claim coverage in just one moment. All right, resetting the table here a little bit. The Giants at least have one waiver claim in the door, and that is going to be Anthony Johnson, former DB for the Green Bay Packers, now a member of the New York Football Giants. He came out in the 2023 draft, 7th rounder, so that can tell you something. You know, the Giants have a player like that as it stands in Trey Hawkins III. So obviously it's going to be a deeper cut type of player. And then if we talk about what has he done? Well, in 2023, he's under 24, will be 25 years old this upcoming season, 12 games, 4 starts. And if we look inside some of the advanced numbers on him, he was only targeted 13 times in those 4 games that he started, did come away with an interception, allowed 8 completions, 61.5%, a QB rating of 66.8. with a alarming, I would say, 24 combined tackles, 8 missed tackles, though, so 25% missed tackle rate. Listen, you can also sit here and say it's a relatively small sample size. He did play 303 snaps on defense, 40%, and then also 57 snaps on special teams, 19%. So a little bit of maybe special teams value just in case. I do wonder, now they have him at safety when he was playing there, so are they going to treat him as such for the Giants? Will they look at any positional flexibility? It was reported by Duggan that they wanted to add a safety. This would certainly represent that. We'll get a look also at his draft profile coming out to see if he profiled exclusively as someone that would go to safety, if he has any other positional versatility, and what the expectations were for him coming into the NFL. So far, no other additional notes as far as anyone else that is going to be coming to the New York Football Giants at this point, though we did expect that there was going to be a handful of names. Anthony Johnson Jr., by the way, just to be clear, he came out. We'll go ahead and just give you the brief bullet points. Taking a look to see what his 40 time ran out coming out of college. 6 foot, 205 coming out. Had a 40 time of 4.54, which is pretty respectable out there at the safety position. Gives a good grade overall. 100.1 when targeted in college, but had everything basically across the board. 77 percentile in terms of tackling, run defense, coverage, zone, and man press. Was looked at as an undrafted free agent, but obviously got picked in the 7th round by the Green Bay Packers. And if we think about where he kind of stacks up inside of these rooms, again, I mentioned among safeties, he's in a good 60th almost percentile in terms of 40 time. The height is undersized. The weight was undersized, at least coming out. But he offered some nice measurables in terms of the 10 yard. The vertical was very good, 75th percentile, and also strong in the broad jump. I mean, listen, these are all baseline things, and you're only going to find out once he gets himself in this room. What I will say is having another young player to put into the mix, it can't hurt to do it. So that's at least where we stand right now. The only one reported from Tom Pelissero as far as I can see. Keeping it updated here. Also have Field Yates looking at a couple of things. And it looks like former, by the way, QB for the Patriots, Bailey Zappi, is going to be making a decision to go to the Chiefs on their practice squad. So there's just some other names flying around right now. The Cardinals are re-signing Desmond Ridder. That came in just about 5 minutes ago. So he'll go through to the practice squad. He'll stay at home with his most recent team in the Cardinals. And then re-signing quarterback are the Bears, Austin Reed. He'll go to their practice squad as well. So Tom Pelissero working hard right now to continue to find all the news and nuggets as far as it pertains to not only the league, but the New York Football Giants, obviously. Commanders, they are signing quarterback Sam Hartman, formerly of Notre Dame, I believe. He'll go to their practice squad as well. So there's a lot coming in here in terms of overall updates and news, but we're still waiting for anything really I'll say exciting for the New York Football Giants. The one part that I'll remind everybody about too, and we've talked about this before, the New York Giants, when they went back to the in-season hard knocks, or sorry, the off-season hard knocks, and said, hey, if we go get you Brian Burns, Shane Bowen, that's what you get. You're going to get this elite electric player. We're going to re-up him. Defensive front's going to be dynamic. We're going to get all this pressure. But that has to be enough for you defensively. Now, whether or not, when you looked at that and then you go into the draft and what they could have done at the top of the second, the run on cornerbacks, all of that plays a factor here. But it's not, they didn't say, and then we'll go look at free agency for help in the secondary. And then, XYZ. You want to bring in players. We'll see how it shakes out. But you do have to acknowledge that there's only so much money to go around. And I know fans don't like to necessarily hear that. And you do have a lot invested inside of that defense, whether from draft capital and guys like Thibodeau or in free agency acquisitions or trades, and extensions in terms of Dexter Lawrence, Bobby Okereke, right? Brian Burns. I mean, there's a lot of money invested there. So it means that your secondary, who has talent in Deonte Banks, a first-round pick, and then also guys that you've been able to find and identify on other rosters like Jason Pinnock, they're going to have to figure this out. And that may be closer to what we're talking about than not, though I wouldn't shy away from the Giants still adding another body in that room. I'll throw this up there. Why? Because let's go Big Blue. You're darn right. That's what it should be. We want this to be not only just covering what the Giants are doing, and I'm going to flip the script here and get this looking a little bit more fun. I think we'll go with that. There we go. Getting this. Days like these they can feel deflating if your team doesn't get the name that you wanted or the player that you thought would be good or just the positional depth that you wanted to see them get. But as we're going to turn our attention when we go into next week, it becomes about the roster you have, which players you think can have an impact, and trying to make some strong plays on Sundays and win some football games for the Giants. So whether or not the Giants add anybody or everybody that you're hoping for them to, ultimately, we're going to get excited about the roster that you currently have. And so when we talk about back-end decisions like this, it's easy, as I said before, to lose sight of the talent you brought in through the draft and Malik Neighbors, the offensive line free agencies that acquisitions that you made, and also just the strength of some of your key positions defensively. Not getting my hopes up, but can't wait for Daniel Jones to prove wrong all the naysayers. I mean, listen, that's you can. That's fine. I'm not going to judge anybody for wanting to be optimistic coming into the season, not just overall for the team, but even with Daniel Jones. I think, the concern is for me, we can spend a brief moment as we wait for more updates. The concern for me is that, hey, a player like Daniel Jones, the injuries, let's get clean of it. That would certainly be something that you could be excited about. However, the concern that I've presented since last year is less about we don't have to go a mile deep on Daniel Jones. He said at the start of last year, prior to injury, he seemed to have regressed in terms of progression reads. It looked like that was taking a step forward the year prior, and then all of a sudden, it felt like it had regressed. And people would point to the play of the offensive line and being a little bit, skittish under center. But I haven't seen that yet, and we're not going to. You can go back and look at some of the one preseason game where he got reps and see some similar traits happening. I need to see that he's bucked that trend completely, because whether or not he can perform at a respectable level this upcoming season, I'm never going to come out of a game where he looks good and, completes 66% of his passes, doesn't throw interceptions, doesn't have turnovers, and knock him. But I think in the long-term view of this season, we're going to watch for whether or not they are designing the offense to be three-step drop and get the ball out, right? Basically, remove the need for progressive reads and say, if it's designed to go deep, you're going to go deep. If it's designed to be the slant, you're going to the slant. And I think that those are kind of the things that I'm really watching for on a deeper level when it comes to Daniel Jones. And that's regardless of long-term outlook or what we think is going to be the case and all those other things that we discussed. Like, if he's the quarterback, I'm going to hope that it works out for him. No, I would not rather have, I see it in a question in the chat there, I would not rather have Perrine than Eric Gray. Kareem's been around the league. He's a veteran. He certainly has experience. Eric Gray is a second-year running back that this team invested in, and that over the course of this training camp has shown some real growth and has gotten us a little bit more excited about how he can contribute to this team. So no, I'm not looking at this moment, off the top of my head, guys that we know are available and cuts and all this and that. I don't really look out across the league and say, oh boy, I would drop Eric Gray for player X. Now, it doesn't mean there isn't somebody there. But just, top of my head. And if you mention a guy like Perrine, that's not going to be somebody that I'm going to worry about. El Scorcho is keeping a close eye on QBs in college, looking for the next Giants QB. Yeah, for sure. I cover the Brooklyn Nets as well for the Locked On Network, and we're talking a lot about next year's draft class. That's something we're going to keep an eye on, watching some of those upper lottery players and where they might fall. The only thing for me is it does depend on how the season goes, right? So keeping an eye on quarterbacks isn't really not a negative, but I have stood on the premise that I don't think the New York Giants are going to jump automatically right into the QB waters next year. Now, that is based on the idea that, hey, can Daniel Jones or injury, Drew Lock, right? Can they be serviceable enough where you can see, development and growth from the offense overall, not necessarily about them individually? Then that can be, I'm going to say, okay. But it's actually one of the knocks about why I thought they should have, yes, it's P. Ryan, excuse me. as I remember, often referred to on radio, local radio, for him, for the running back when he was with the Jets for a while. If they perform, you want this team to perform well, to say that the offense is working, that the offensive line is working, that the running game looks pretty good, that the defense is developing, like all these things. So it's hard for me to worry too much about quarterbacks in next year's draft class, because I think even if Daniel Jones plays at a mediocre level this year, and then even if Drew Lock, injury otherwise, a mediocre level, I still think this team is going to win some football games. So, projecting that they're going to be in the top 3 picks, in the draft next year is a little bit difficult for me. But it doesn't mean that it's not a bad idea to keep an eye on some of those guys and decide whether or not, do you want the Giants to be all in on that quarterback next year? Is there a prospect that checks all the right boxes where you say, hey, we couldn't move up in this draft class, now we can sit there if we're at the top and take the guy that we want? Another one here from Cy Guy Bry is next season's Heisman Trophy favorite any good? Cam somebody indeed, Cy Guy. I'd have to take a look at that in full transparency, because I don't go into the college game until it's the off season and we're talking about looking at those players and trying to figure out where everybody fits. Updating here again too, nothing new as of that last Tom Pelissero update. We can confirm though that Turbo Miller is signing with the Giants practice squad per sources. He will be back, so that's good. That's Andy Makowitz really wanted him to be a part of this team, wanted him to make the 53. And again, when you're talking about the 4th running back on a roster, and that's at least how we had it hierarchied in the camp, another team needs to look at their 3rd running back and say, oh, he would be an exponential boost over top of that. So good to see him back as well. Also, 2nd-year safety is the one that we talk about. And I don't see anything. None of the Giants' cuts were claimed by other teams. Pat Leonard just updated us on that. So nobody that the Giants cut has made their way to anywhere else to this point. And at this point, as we come up on the 1 o'clock hour, that might be it. Like, there are updates coming in as of 19, 20 minutes ago. I'm going to check in with Field Yates' feed here, just for any general ones that have come through. Nothing new on the Giants as of right now. Yeah, I mean, they were up next. So the Patriots, who were up with, and because there's no, again, limitation to it, so you put in as many as you want. The Panthers claimed the most players with 6. And then the Patriots were up next with 4. They claimed Curtis Jacobs, linebacker, offensive tackle, Demontre Jacobs as well, so double Jacobs there. Eric Johnson, defensive tackle, and then tackle Zachary Thomas. So they went into it as well, going pretty deep on theirs. A little bit disappointing, I think, at least at this moment, that the Giants weren't able to address some more areas of concern. Now, that being said, go back into the players that we kept and what the roster currently looks like. So we know the Giants will have to make a move of some kind here when it comes to adding in another safety to the room. Javarius Owens might be the most logical, obviously. And then maybe he cycles back through the practice squad, certainly. And we're starting to get drips and drabs about who's going to be on that practice squad for the team. But we can go back into our initial 53 that Andy and I had gone through. And for the most part, this stayed accurate. We came pretty close on most of them. There's a couple of differences. Again, should have stuck with Bryce Ford Wheaton making the 53 for me initially, as I had that pegged and then backed off of it out of fear. Boykins didn't make it through there. McKenzie went on IR, as we know. But as it stands right now, from a depth perspective, okay, in the running back room, do we feel good about Gray and the upside of Tracy Jr.? I do. There's certainly some questions in the tight end room. Bellinger, we were always an advocate that he wasn't going anywhere. How quickly does Theo Johnson get up to speed as being a pass-catching weapon for them? That kind of matters here. By and large, across the offensive line, Ezeudu, Stinney, Schlottman, Kubis right now is in there as well. Kept him in the mix, and then Neal. So where do we stand on making any type of margin move there? If the Giants, whether or not we think all the reps were pretty in preseason for Ezeudu, they say, hey, we like it. We like what we saw from him at least, then we're willing to go forward with it. And it's also about opportunity to claim other guys that you believe would be an upgrade in that regard. Defensively, same thing. Chapman, we talk about, obviously Lawrence, Riley, and Davidson are still on this roster. So that's your depth as of right now. I'd like to see something happen there potentially. Nunez Roche, believe that Rodgers is going to end up on the practice squad. He flashed a little bit. And then we talked about it before. You have Burns and you have Thibodeau. You have Basham and Ojulari. I think the sun fading on Ojulari's time with the Giants is what spurs on maybe wanting to utilize him to make a different move. Still think the trade could be possible, depending on what the Giants feel like they need to do. And then you get into guys like, obviously, Okereke and McFadden. We said Coughlin and Muasau, and then also kept Johnson in that room too. Again, maybe not perfect from a depth standpoint. A lot of special teams value in that room, but we love Okereke, and we thought that McFadden took real strides last season. So I like the starters there. And then it's really the secondary where we're certainly going to see what happens. McLeod and Flott, obviously. You have Banks and Hawkins. Like, there's some guys to watch here along with Phillips and then Simmons, who, again, I'm going to keep labeling more as a linebacker-ish type player than, linebacker safety than cover corner or slot corner cover. Got to get him on game day. We just got to see him, right? There's a world where Cordell Flott comes out, and I'm not saying he's going to light the world on fire week 1 against the Vikings, but maybe he just looks solid. Healthy, ready to go, looks solid. Maybe Trey Hawkins can just give you a handful of reps when called upon. They're going to get burned. They're going to get burned at times, but that's the reality. Bronx Boy, yeah, we had Anthony Johnson. That's the one. Former DB for the Green Bay Packers has been claimed by the New York Giants. That's it as it stands right now. So we'll see. We'll see if we get anything else from it. If Ezeudu plays, the season is over. I mean, let's remember too. Obviously, if you're talking about Andrew Thomas goes down, right, then it's a disaster of epic proportions for the offensive line. Knock on wood. Illuminor has looked very good and solid, and we believe that there he is, starting right tackle, right? If you said that he maybe went down for a little bit, like it does matter relative to the rest of the offensive line. If one player goes down, Thomas excluded because he's his own unique guy. But, Illuminor is a solid player, and we feel good about him starting at right tackle. But if he goes down and you still have Thomas and Runyon, and we'll see how John Michael Schmitz looks, and Van Roten, like, you're not going to sit there and say, I'm not going to sit there and say, well, that's it. Wrap it up. Ezeudu's playing at right tackle now. I think it'll be interesting if that comes to pass and what roster moves the Giants make. But I think that the offensive line is in totality in a much better spot than it was last season. So you have to be a little more confident in one player going down for a handful of games and being able to still sustain a level of success on running and passing plays, obviously, in front of Daniel Jones as well. Yeah, it is a little bit disappointing. I think someone mentioned it there in the chat. Like, just disappointing to not see maybe a couple more moves. And basically we'll end up reverting back to the players that we look at that were on this roster and what their impact can be. So we walked through those. Newman and obviously Pinnock are some of the primaries. Belton is in that room as well. And we'll see. We'll see if any other decisions get made. Maybe it comes via trade. And the only other thing here would be, as we start to cement, and I'll just reset the board before we get out of here, and we'll come back in tomorrow morning with all the updates and break down the practice squad in totality. Remember, any team that, oh yeah, well, sure, if you say, folks up here, if you lose Dex, right? Yeah, I mean, that's it. It's a good reminder, right? Like the absolute cannot afford to lose player on offense is Andrew Thomas. The absolute cannot afford to lose player on defense is Dexter Lawrence, right? If you lose those guys, then you're obviously in a world of hurt because you can't just replace not only your best players, but depth, and you look in behind and you see what's going on there. I'll also just note, Edwin mentioned about moving Neal into guard. This is something that we've talked about earlier in the offseason. I said, listen, if he needs to make it as a tackle, just that's where you want to play him first. If he fails as a tackle, then I don't think that he has the value to this roster in totality. And this is really speaking to when people talked about, oh, kick him inside to guard before you had Van Roten, before you had John Runyon. It was, oh, just kick him inside and make him a guard. I would never want to risk moving him into guard and seeing if that worked out, even though we understand there's less pressure at that role than at right tackle. But the idea of just put him in there. Now at this point, he's on the roster. Try him out anywhere you want. Try to find value out of him anywhere that you want. But the reality is, when you watch some of these things and you watch some of the reps, I just see a guy that's struggling. So maybe he would be better at guard. But I don't know if the Giants, it's oftentimes you talk about players like this. If he doesn't figure it out this year, obviously, but then you're talking about it was a bit of a bust. And you talk about a player like this, obviously Eric Flowers is a good example of it when he was in, but it's just a player that ultimately is not going to find his career for the team that drafted him, because you were drafted to be a starting caliber tackle, and now you're trickling down the line. So when his contract comes up, you're not going to see them make that decision. They're not going to pick up a fifth-year option on their top 10 first-round pick at the right tackle spot because he hasn't proven that you want to save the quote-unquote money, right? He's going to go to market and see where he lands. So I think that's ultimately where he's destined. And it's why you look at guys like Kubis who gets brought in and all these players that you have. You say, hey, here are young guys that we think we're developing and we're seeing something in camp. But again, if Evan Neal can turn it around, awesome. We're rooting for everybody to be the best version of themselves because it makes for the best team, of course. That being the case, we will reset the table one more time here. So far, we have Alex Johnson, KJ Cloyd going to be going to the practice squad. I had one more that I had just updated recently. Deontay Turbo Miller, he's going to be on that practice squad as well. These are some ones that we anticipated being there. Cloyd was the one guy we mentioned coming out of that last preseason game, wanted to see him get there. Then we take a look also at McKenzie season-ending IR, which is unfortunate. We also see Adams is going to be designated to return. So that's 4 weeks and then a 21-day window to get put back into the active roster. So we'll see how that shakes out as well. From a waiver claim standpoint, the Giants grabbed DB, formerly from the Green Bay Packers, Anthony Johnson, add him into that safety room, it looks like, and go from there. We that's all we currently have from the Giants side of things. 6 claims came in from the top seeded waiver claims came from the top seeded Carolina Panthers. They needed a lot of bodies, and so they got themselves a lot of bodies. And then they said the Patriots grabbed 4. So you talk about all these cut candidates, and when Carolina grabs their first 3 claims as cornerbacks, who knows, right? The Giants are sitting there at 6, and they're thinking, all right, even if they take a couple of them, some of these guys are going to have to trickle down. And let's do this real quick here. If we think about, I'm trying to think about the guys that would be teams that would have been near the top of this list here, as KJ Hamler, just as a mentioning point here for the Bills, he's going to sign to their practice squad. The 49ers are signing defensive end Jonathan Garvin to their practice squad as well. And we can take a look here real quick as they have the practice squad tracker up at the moment. Let's take a look at the New York Giants and see how official their practice squad currently looks. So the New York Giants, we'll see. Are they going to give us this clean practice squad tracker? Yeah. Do we? No, they're not going to give us an update on it just yet over there. So I'll have to wait to see where it stands for them once we get through the initial, unless I'm just checking real quick here. No, not even close to being updated over there. So waste of a trip over to NFL.com to look for any type of update when it comes to the practice squad. So I just want to real quick on Tom Pelissero. He had a couple posted up here that showed. Here we go. So we talk about those waiver claims. Carolina, we said those 6 that they grabbed. Now Cincinnati, no. Detroit, I'm only looking for teams that would have been lower on the list there. Anybody that would have grabbed players of importance for the Giants in terms of trying to improve their team. Maybe you want to look at, the Raiders. They had a decent, but they claimed a DB, Thomas Harper. They also claimed a defensive tackle, Jonah Lualu. I'm going to mess up that name, so I'm going to move on from it. Watch me sputter with my mouth there. New England claimed a whole bunch of guys, but nobody in the secondary. Mentioned the Giants. And then it was Julius Wood. Tennessee claimed him from Dallas. So there's not a ton in terms of secondary players that got claimed, including cornerback and all the way back to safety. I only see 3, 4 Kansas City. They claimed Eric Scott from Dallas. These would be teams that were behind the Giants, obviously. But 1, 2, 3, 4, at least early reported. And then we could take a look at if you take away the Carolina Panthers, there was only 5 other guys in the secondary. And then the Carolina Panthers claimed 3 and got it up to 8. So that may just be the way it looked there. And it does feel symbolically familiar as the way the top of the second round went maybe for the Giants, right? Well, we want a cornerback. Then the run happens. You're not quite there. You've already given up an asset when you're making the deal to get Brian Burns, and you don't have the ability or the desire maybe to move up and attack that, and you kind of miss out and you have to pivot a little bit. As Cy Guy Bry does the work for me in the chat, thank you for answering Formula Red. It is Anthony Johnson, safety, Green Bay, the only claim that we've seen here. And this actually, I'll just highlight him because so many things that I could tell you about, guys. If you're just joining us live on YouTube, talking about the updates for the Giants, the waiver claims, only Anthony Johnson safety from the Packers, but he was Lewis Seen is one of the cornerbacks that I said, if you're going to take a shot on somebody, why not take a look at him? Although I don't know, he may have been claimed somewhere else, certainly. And then you get into, I'll highlight Christopher mentioning Xavier Howard. There's free agents that were just on the market as it stood. And that was something that Andy and we talked about over the course of this offseason. I just don't think that price point is going to make sense for the Giants on any of these guys. They're veterans. They're going to they're going to sit here and try to play out the market and see which teams missed out. The Giants would be one of those teams, but unfortunately, I don't think that they're going to have the money in order to be able to bring in those players relative to another roster saying, hey, we'll allocate whatever it is, $6 to $10 million to bring in a player like Xavier Howard. J.C. Jackson was out there. Dory Jackson is still out there. Patrick Peterson, 34 years old. Hard to think about that. And then, Steven Nelson. The one that we had mentioned previously was Akello Witherspoon, formerly of the LA Rams. He's 29 years old. We like some of the tape that he has on there as well, excuse me. But there's not a ton. There's not a ton of guys that get you super excited in terms of going out and getting them off free agency. So we'll see. And again, when we talk about what does it tell us about the upcoming year? Well, there's a world where it tells us that the Giants are going to develop some of the young talent. And yeah, they may sacrifice wins in order to, confirm that. So maybe we don't see those moves come ahead of the regular season, but as we get into the season, we start to see them go out and make a claim here, start to bring in player XYZ, because they're going to go ahead and say, we understand that Trey Hawkins developmentally is never going to get there. I'm not saying that's the case. I hope it isn't. Or they look at their practice squad. We're going to elevate Cloyd. If we feel like we need some depth at the linebacker spot, let's give him a look. See if he can go ahead and give us some quality reps. Those are still things that I think are realities, but I do still believe, and we talk about a guy like Muasau, maybe a player like Coughlin. There are still names on this roster as it stands right now that I could see being moved in order to make room for somebody else, excuse me. But by and large, it looks like that's what we're going to be going with. Giants stay with their 3 quarterbacks, as we mentioned. They stay with a lot of familiar faces at the top of the wide receiver room. They keep Bryce Ford Wheaton. So we'll go ahead and do a full reset here tomorrow when we talk about what the Giants have accomplished, not necessarily in waiver claims right now, but in totality of this offseason. Where do we stand now? Taking it all the way back to the draft. And one thing that we did want to do, entering in what is going to be a critical year 3 for Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll. What is the snapshot going back to these last 3 years, or coming to the year 3? What is the snapshot of 3 off seasons, and how do we feel about the roster? What have we improved? Where have we failed to improve enough? And what are the expectations as we come into this season on an individual player level, but then also on a collective level? What does the record need to look like to go forward another year with this tandem and say, okay, now let's get to the draft. Let's talk about quarterbacks. Let's talk about next steps in improving this roster, talk about next year's free agent class, et cetera. So we want to do that to button things up before we turn our full attention to this season, to the Minnesota Vikings in week 1. So we'll try to do that over the next couple of days. Wrap up practice squad, wrap up waiver claims, give our high-level take on the roster, and then maybe talk a little bit about what is on the line for Joe Schoen, maybe even more so than than head coach Brian Daboll at this time. I'll throw in one more shout out because Papa just came in here, and I want everybody that came in on the course of this live to know how much we appreciate coming in, supporting, and being part of the conversation. Really means the world to us. Elijah Wilkinson from the Cards was cut and would be a great budget, versatile offensive lineman. Yeah, there was a number of offensive linemen that I think got to give you a little bit of buzz. And some of this comes back to, for me, how do they feel about it? I thought Stinney's reps were good, mostly good, sometimes shaky in the preseason. You had Morrissey start higher on the depth chart, then lose it to Schlotman. So what does that say about where they stand at the center position? Kubis, young, they like what he saw. Are they confident enough to carry him into the season? 10 current offensive linemen. They only had 9 a year ago. So yeah, little things like that are certainly pivots here. But we'll see how the Giants choose to make those decisions when it comes to bumping guys off the roster down to the practice squad. Any guys that are going to get elevated during the course of the season, just making room for all these players. Woo, baby. That being the case, it's 1:17 on the dial, and that is exactly the amount of time that I planned on talking about one waiver claim for the New York Football Giants, but also a great discussion with everybody. I hope this has been a fun one. And obviously, El Scorcho, hey, thank you for being a part of it. Really, we genuinely appreciate when everyone shows up, when they get into the conversation, get into the chat, throw out the names that you want to see, get into, the nitty gritty of this roster and our expectations for the upcoming year. I'll throw up another one here. Steve, let's judge Schoen based on projected failure. That is fair and balanced. I don't know what that means. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about examining 2 draft classes that have come in. We're talking about judging 2 free agency classes that he's been able to go out, trades that he's been able to make. So there's plenty here to look at and say, what have we seen to this point? And then coming into year number 3, say, okay, you now have 3 off seasons. What does the product on the field look like? And that includes everything top to bottom, including re-signing Daniel Jones to the contract, right? Moving off of Saquon Barkley, trading for Brian Burns. I'm not labeling any of these things as good, bad, indifferent. I'm saying these are all key decisions that had to be made by the GM over these past 3 off seasons. So there's plenty there. And it doesn't mean take a negative slant. It just means to take an honest look at it. You can be excited about the young players, excited about what this team could be capable of doing, but you also have to run it through the realistic prism of where have we seen the successes come through and where have we maybe seen some areas that Joe Schoen needs to have learned from and improved on over these past 3 off seasons. So just a reminder for everybody, we try to do exactly what Steve tongue-in-cheek was mentioning. Be fair and balanced about it. We want to be excited for the team. We also want to be honest where we think this team is going to struggle at times. And on that, we hope that you will get over to YouTube, subscribe, turn on the alerts so you know when we're going live. We'll do at least one of those a week all throughout the season. And then, of course, on your podcast feeds, please, 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 means the world to us. If you can go over to your podcast feeds, subscribe. If they give the option to leave a 5-star review, greatly appreciate it. It means a lot to us on that side to continue to grow that aspect of our show. But no matter how you consume us, we greatly appreciate it. at Adam Armbrecht, at AMAC214, and at One Giant Podcast over on X. We'll be back in tomorrow, breaking down the state of the roster currently and starting to prepare to look ahead to week number 1 against the Minnesota Vikings, where we put all the offseason moves behind us and dive in full force the New York Football Giants 2024-2025 season. Appreciate every single person in the chat. Thank you so much. And if Andrew Makowitz was here, what he would want, need, and nay, demand that people know is, as always, let's go Big Blue.